Good morning, everybody, and welcome to session A5 for ASFPM 2021's conference. You are in Innovative Risk Communications. Our first presentation is Weathering the Storm of Project Development, Public Affairs Tips and Tricks. And our presenter is Rocky Schneider of Advanced Engineering and Environmental Services. Rocky has worked on flood protection projects in the Fargo-Moorhead region for more than a decade. Born and raised in Fargo, he attended the University of Minnesota for his undergraduate and received an MBA from North Dakota State University. Rocky previously worked for the U.S. Senate Budget Committee under Congressman Earl Pomeroy and for the Home Builders Association of Fargo-Moorhead. In 2013, Rocky joined his current company and specializes in civil and environmental engineering. He was instrumental in leading public outreach and public affairs efforts to procure more than $3 billion in local, state, and federal funding. He lives in Fargo with his wife and 2 children and enjoys pickleball, bicycling, and his own jokes.
Hi, I'm Rocky Schneider. I'm a certified floodplain manager with AE2S. It's a regional consulting firm. I'm located in the Fargo, North Dakota office, and I'm here to talk to you today about public affairs tips and tricks for weathering the storm of project development. Spent 8 years on the FM Area Diversion Project. It's a $3 billion flood project in Fargo, North Dakota and Moorhead, Minnesota. So it spans across 2 states and multiple local entities as well. It's now under construction, but it didn't always start that way. It's been under analysis since 2008 and included the flood of record in 2009. And so it's taken over a decade of different challenges and hurdles, and we're going to talk to you today about a couple of those and some of the tips and tricks we use to keep the progress moving forward and keep the support from the public and the elected officials. The project itself, there's actually a presentation at this conference later today. If you're interested in learning more about the project itself or the public-private partnership, I encourage you to attend that. I'm not going to get into a lot of project details today, but we will use it as the basis for our tips and tricks. The Fargo-Moorhead region lies at the intersection of 2 different interstates, and it's also along a major rail corridor from oil from western North Dakota. So there is a really national interest in this, as it's a transportation hub and is necessary for oil transportation as well. The flood of record in Fargo-Moorhead area was in 2009. This made major national news, and it also was a catalyst to jumpstart the 2008 federal feasibility study. It was well-timed. It took a lot of effort, and it made a lot of news because it took over 7 million sandbags. And you'll see here a FEMA picture from the Fargo Dome, where we had over 150,000 volunteer hours in order to save the city. The reason why this was such a major effort is because of the topography in the region is really flat. The elevation only changes about a foot every mile, and you can see, from one end of the city to the other if there were no buildings in place. They're as flat as it can be. And so you have to fight the flood not just in flood-prone areas, but it's really the whole Red River Valley corridor, all the way from South Dakota up into Canada. So anywhere along a metro area, you will have flood problems. And you'll see on this picture here, the outline of this is what the project would be. The black line there is the diversion channel, and then the dotted line on the south is where the dam and embankment is. You'll see that during a 100-year flood in blue, pretty much everything floods. You'll see Minnesota on the east side and North Dakota on the west side, and right through the metro area is all the floodwaters. And then after the project is complete, you can see the floodwaters have been removed, but you see flooding still exists around the project. That's because it is flat. It will pool up south of town. So you can see the 2 differences as I flip back and forth between the slides of where the water was before and where the water is after. You can see some additional water to the south behind the dam, and the rest of it will flow through the diversion channel north all the way into Canada. This has been a long process. The feasibility study started in 2008, and then the flood record in 2009, again, was the catalyst to move things forward. The Chief's report through the Corps of Engineers was signed in 2011 with the record of decision in 2012. It was ultimately received the congressional authorization in 2014. So a new start was received in 2015 with construction starting in 2017. Shortly after that time, we received news of a federal injunction in a court case that had been ongoing since 2013. And it really put everything on hold again and it took everybody to go back to the drawing board. We brought in both governors from North Dakota and Minnesota and regional leaders to come up with a compromise. That was successful and it has moved on. But that was not without a lot of work by a lot of people, and we're going to talk to you about some of the tips and tricks that helped make that successful. Now we're going to talk about a couple of the challenges, 4 specific challenges that we faced through the development of this project before we get to the tips and tricks to give you some additional background on what we were facing. The first challenge is changing floodplains. We're all familiar with this. It's an issue going on around the country, specifically in Fargo-Moorhead, being at the border of 2 different states and 2 different FEMA regions. It's pronounced here, and you'll see on this graph of different colors. You see the red data. That is FEMA's data. It goes through about 1971. That's what they use to determine the regulatory 100-year floodplain. Then you'll see the blue data. That is what the Corps of Engineers decided through an expert panel, what they would use. They call it the wet period. That's what they would use to design a project based on a 100-year flood. And so you can see with these 2 different data sets, you're going to get wildly different 100-year classifications just because of how wet the years were. You can see that in the early part of the century, we had very dry decades, and then the last several decades have been very wet. This created multiple problems. One, the regulatory floodplain was very different than the floodplain we were designing to. Flood insurance regulations did not coordinate with what maps we were showing in public, and so it created a lot of unnecessary anxiety in the housing market and of employers. And so there's also on here, just to fully explain, the green area, every year that goes on, there's an added data set. And so you don't keep going back and redoing the 100-year flood. So we know we've had all these wet years that haven't even been factored in. So we knew this was a growing problem. And what do you design a project for? Do you design it to the regulatory standard, or do you design it knowing going forward the 100-year floodplain is going to change? And it has changed in the area probably about every decade. And the changes have come differently in Fargo and in Moorhead. They're a couple of years off on their changes. And so it's created a lot of confusion, a lot of sort of distrust of the government and their facts, and it's easy to spin it any way you want. Another challenge we had was permitting, probably not unfamiliar to a lot of projects. This was a little unique because we got congressional authorization for the project prior to receiving all state approvals. And so from the Corps of Engineers standpoint, they were mandated by Congress to build this project. And so they started building. It was not a high priority for them at the time to receive the state approvals ahead of start of the construction. Through the court process, that ultimately was decided that we did need to get the state permit ahead of time. And so ended up with a lawsuit. Started in 2013. The lawsuit was resolved toward the end of 2020. So it was over 7 years of lawsuits. Ultimately a federal injunction for several years in there. It required everybody to go back to the drawing board, come up with a compromise. And ultimately it was successful, but it was not without a lot of starts and stops of the project, a lot of confusion in the public. Elected officials weren't sure if they should prioritize money for the project. How long do you keep it going? And ultimately, we're hoping that this can get resolved before the next big flood. That's the problem we were trying to solve, and so it kept our focus looking straight ahead. Another challenge is just dealing in the political environment. There's a lot of leadership changes. This project received congressional authorization while President Obama was president. And when President Trump was elected, you have a change of administration, all the officials change. You sort of have to re-educate, have all those relationships reestablished at the federal level, trying to get in the budgets. Again, with a different administration, is it seen as a prior administration priority? Should it continue on? And then ultimately now we're into a new administration again. And as these parties change as well, the leadership isn't as consistent as you'd like to be in a long-term project like this. In addition, our congressional delegation, we started, we have 2 senators, obviously, in North Dakota and 2 in Minnesota, and 1 congressman in North Dakota and 1 in Minnesota. Originally, all 6 were Democrat elected officials. And now we have 4 Republican elected officials and 2 Democrats. So we had a change of party leadership locally as well, which created a number of different hurdles as well as you lose clout. The earmarks were no longer a thing. And we were trying to educate a whole new class of leaders. In addition, on the local level, The authority that is in charge, the Metro Flood Diversion Authority that's in charge of the project locally, has 4 different elected bodies that make up the board. So there's been several mayors that have turned over in each of those communities. Different councilmen and commissioners have turned over. And so what we really tried to do is stay on top of that and make sure this was a priority. And we'll get into that with our tips and tricks. One of the other significant challenges we faced was just changes in media apathy, and the alternative media sources out there now. From 2008 when this started to now, the face of media has changed almost completely. And so we've had to deal with that through project development. Early on it was you had long-standing reporters that had lived in the community, they knew about flooding, they lived through the events. But the further we get from that record flood, the more flooding amnesia takes hold. Younger reporters come on scene, they maybe, are not as experienced, or they didn't live through the flood, they don't have that shared sort of experiences that the rest of the community does. And so you're constantly trying to educate them on why this is an important project, why is it a high priority. In addition, just covering the same story for over a decade, it's tough to really have something new or interesting to tell them. The sort of baby steps that take through project development are not always that interesting. And so you're trying to sell a story over and over and over again to new reporters, and it just became a real issue. And on the flip side, a blog was started, several blogs of opposition to the project. As you know, we had a lawsuit for 7 years. That was a motivated opposition, so they had a reason to have consistent updates from their blog that we couldn't always replicate on the private media side. They also had a wonderful cartoonist, and you can see on the screen here one of their cartoons. I pulled this one up here because it utilizes Rocky and Bullwinkle as a subject, and you can see there that cute little squirrel. He's got a slight resemblance to somebody else, and so I thought I'd show you this one. But again, very clever opposition, and it made the job of making sure the right facts were out there, made that very difficult for us. Now I'd like to share with you some public affairs tips and tricks that we use throughout the project development. And I try to put the ones on here that I feel are the most repeatable on other projects across the country, and hopefully you can pick up a thing or two and take it back home and use it during your project development. One of the first things we did is realize that elected officials have to be our leaders and our advocates. We know they are going to be the ones out in the community talking about this. We know they're going to run elections and have to talk about what issues are important to them. Ultimately, they're going to vote on what gets funding, what's a priority for their city or their county, or on the federal level as well. So we identified this early on and knew that we had to make sure we stayed in front of them. And so even though this was a problem and that went on a long time and it may not be fresh in the voters' minds, we had to make sure it was fresh in the candidates' minds and in the elected officials' minds. So one of the things we put a lot of priority on was candidate forums, both public forums and private forums. We were at every one. We made sure our flood project was top of mind. There was always a question about it. We made sure to have one-on-ones with candidates before their elected officials to make sure that they had the information they need, they had the questions they could answer, so they didn't take an early position that you end up having to spend twice as long to correct. Also, we found that candidates are a lot more willing to meet with you and listen and make promises. And once they're elected official, they become much more busy, and it's just tough to get that same level of attention. And so we really tried to focus on them. We also know that they go out in the public, they go out to civic groups, trade groups, and everything. We knew that would just be beneficial. Another advantage of working with elected officials on a flood project is flooding is not partisan. And it makes strange bedfellows. You can have very different ideologies, but feel very passionate about protecting your community from flooding. And this has really been advantageous to us. As we've talked about, the administration changes, and our senators have changed parties, our congressman has changed parties, and locally we've changed parties on numerous leaderships as well, but it hasn't impacted our project because we went into it early on knowing that you bring people together. The public likes to see bipartisanship. They like to find opportunities in which they can work across the aisle. And this project was held up as a symbol for that. And we took that and ran with it and tried in every situation, press conferences, any sort of interviews. We always tried to make sure you're not just speaking to one side or the other. You have two different leaders there talking to both sides, bringing people together in support of one project. With each of the tips and tricks, we do have some deliverables we wanted to highlight. The ones we use for this one are tours. There's nothing like getting a captive audience on a tour, showing them, either where the flooding happened, where the home buyouts have taken place, where a project's going to be built, and then once it's under construction, it's even better. You get them right in the middle of it, see the heavy equipment. You can see it changes their minds right away. Especially in today's age where everybody has a phone, it's easy to lose an audience. Probably lost many of you by now. But if I had you captive in a tour bus, I could be staring at you and talking to you the whole time, and I knew you were going to listen and retain a lot. We focused on that with both elected officials, visiting officials, VIPs that came, and candidates themselves. It was a high focus for us. Another thing we did is really tried to personalize the project. We created a number of 3 questions videos to really try to put a face to the project. And this is, again, another way we could highlight the bipartisanship of this project, the vast support across both cities, both states, across all ideologies. So we really try to connect with people of all stripes. Another thing we did was create a consistent talking points document. This was a great way to make sure that everybody had the same facts, the same project updates, and really the difficulty, maybe the negative of having so many different leaders, so many different elected officials speaking on behalf of the project is you hope they're all saying the same thing or you're going to confuse people even more. So this was our way to make sure everybody was on point, saying the same thing, speaking the same language, but they're all speaking to different audiences. And it ended up working really nicely for us. In addition to elected officials, we like to highlight our community leaders or our thought leaders. We really tried to identify them, either that's business leaderships, nonprofit leaderships, you go to your chambers or your trade associations, try to figure out who's going out in the community and talking to people. That's, at the cafe in the morning, at the civic group over lunch. These are the type of people you want to get in front of, make sure they know the facts, make sure they're talking about the right thing, because if they're not talking about the right thing, they potentially could be talking about something they heard from somebody else, and that you may not like that. You don't control that narrative anymore. So we really tried to get out and talk to those leaderships. We tried to get to the groups like the Kiwanis clubs or the Lions clubs, make sure we're getting in front of them on a regular basis as the project changes or updates happen. Really make sure we get in front of them, make it interesting, talk to them about what's important to them so that we know they're going to go out and share it with people. And that's really the best thing we could do, and it's also the cheapest way. You can't always afford television or radio or newspaper ads, those type of things. But if you can get out and talk to people, that's a good way to share information. There are a couple of specific tactics in this in which helped us, and a little reluctant to share this, but we did hire some third-party help. Both, when we went out to the capitals, both in Bismarck and St. Paul, we had bus rides full of people, our advocates, and we try not to burn out the volunteers, but all of our business leaders, all of our trade associations, we made sure they were supportive of the project and had all the right information to advocate on behalf of us. We also worked with them to hire a third-party firm in which could help assist write editorials, write comments for EIS periods, made sure that every time there was a public comment period, their voices were heard loud and clear. And that was really helpful. It's part of the process or the game of getting through project development. And if you don't do it, somebody else is going to. And it worked out really well. Another thing we did is we created a documentary of the project. There are such good stories when you have a natural disaster that it's tough to capture them all. But we created a documentary that we shared on public access that ran over and over and over to make sure everybody remembered the stories, remembered the flood, tried to bring back that shared experience that people forget about. So even when it's not springtime, not flooding, people can see the imagery and go, oh yeah, I've been there, or wow, look how much water that is. And so we found those just a lot of ways to get out there, get in front of people that share their opinion and really form the narrative of the public. We talked a lot about the media. The media is a key part of any strategy to weather the storm of project development. We talked about some of the difficulties of turnover, a lot of young reporters these days, underfunded reporters. They really just want the quick story, the quick talking point. It really does pay back if you spend your time talking with them, having them learn about the project, so they understand that there's more to it than just the soundbite of the day, or they understand what nuance did change from the project and why it's important. And so some of the things we did on this is regular editorial boards with newspapers and television stations, regular radio interviews with their leaderships, so that they could understand what's important to the elected officials, to the local business leaders, who also happen to be their advertisers, so they're always willing to listen. and so that they knew what was important and what the public wanted to hear about. So when the stories did come up, they were more often on our side than against us, and that was really helpful to make sure that the right narrative was out there. Another thing we did on a regular basis was hold educational sessions for the whole media team. So we'd go to the local newspaper, and their advertisers and their editors and their reporters would all come in and get a presentation similar to this one about the project. And we just found that baseline, coming to talk to them when there wasn't a story, wasn't a problem, was just really interesting for them. Do it over a lunch type thing. They got a baseline knowledge of it, so when the stories did come up or when we wanted to pitch a story to them, it wasn't as awkward. It wasn't a cold call. It's people we knew, they had talked to us before, they think it's interesting. They're more likely to cover it in a more positive light. A couple of the key deliverables that we did to sort of highlight our work. We know imagery is important, and so we tried to keep imagery updated. Through project development, you can get really stagnant, use the same image over and over and over again. It's tough to tell what's new. So as soon as we could, we went out there and used drone technology, did regular flyovers of project construction, personalized it with hearing from different leaders, tried to really give them something new and something interesting to show. So it wasn't just the same information over and over and over again. And so we tried to make use of the changing technology, the changing media landscape, and get out in front of them. Another tip when dealing with the media is know who you're talking to. What we really tried to do is cultivate our go-to sources, knowing that there was going to be a lot of turnover and that they don't have a lot of time or money or funding to make your project a highlight on a regular basis. You find that go-to reporter, the guy or lady who's been in the community a long time, has that same flood experience, knows the importance to the community, is interested in it, so he doesn't mind hearing about it. And so really cultivate that. So when there is a story, you know who you can go to, you know who's going to cover it, you know what questions are probably going to be of interest to him, so you can get that information to him ahead of time so that he can start writing a story as it happens, not wait for it like a press release after the fact. And those are just really helpful. Instead of waiting for the reporter to come to you or working with a different reporter each time, try to know who the go-to reporter is and really cultivate that relationship. The last section on tips and tricks is about transparency. It's an overused buzzword, but it's really important. When you're spending $3 billion of public dollars, public taxpayer dollars on a project, you know you're going to be scrutinized. No matter how transparent you are, you know you're going to hear about it, that money's being laundered or shuffled to the elected officials in support of it. The contractors are making too much money. So you're going to hear all these things. And so the best thing you can do is put it all out there. Let people decide for themselves. There's a lot of ways to do that. One of the first actions taken by the Metro Flood Board of Authority was to create a website, knowing that website was going to be the long-term historic repository for all information, all the studies, all the public comments, how all the dollars are spent. And if you put it all out there, that's really the best thing you can do. But we kind of tried to go one step further in making sure that website, if that was going to be our go-to fact source and point everybody toward that, we added things like an interactive web map. So people could go in, scroll around, see where the impacts of the project are, where flooding is going to be, how flood insurance is impacted by the different maps and the changes to the project. They can make the future decisions if it was their property there. And so what we really tried to do is make that a one-stop shop for everything. In addition to that, the website was also used to live stream all the meetings. So we didn't just show it on the website, but we also showed it on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And so they will be there forever on YouTube. And so anybody can go back, see not just the minutes or the agenda, but you can go watch the meetings, hear what was said, look at the finance packets on all the bills that were approved, and just try to over-inundate people with it. And a lot of people look at the website and say, well, there's too much information on there. It's not organized enough. But I think it was almost purposeful. There's so much been studied on this project. Like most projects, you go through 10 years, you have all sorts of documentation. And so we really tried to just highlight that and make sure that it was all readily available to the public, to the elected officials, so that no matter what issue came up, you could pull it up on your phone. Here's the website, here's the answer right there. And it really was impressive to people as they went through, well, have you thought about this? Have you studied this? How much is this going to cost? And when it's all right at their fingertips, after a while they realize they're going to stop answering questions if they could just Google it. And so that was really our strategy for that. In addition, we really tried to have consistent reporting. So at monthly committee meetings and monthly board meetings, we had standard reports for our land acquisition and for our finances, so that every month people could go and see what's changed, what's different, really get an easy update on the project. If it looks the same every month, you don't spend a lot of work trying to figure it out. You can just go there and say, okay, you're above board. You're doing what you're supposed to. And so even though anytime you spend this much money on a public project, there's a level of scrutiny that goes along with it. These are tips and tricks that can help alleviate a lot of the struggles along the way. I'm happy to talk to you more. You can feel free to email me at the contact information provided. I'm happy to talk to any of you about your project. Hope you picked up some tips and tricks you can take back. Otherwise, I'm happy to start discussion.
Okay, well, thank you for a great presentation, Rocky. We did have a few questions come in, and just as a reminder, you can type questions in the chat at any time throughout all of the presentations. The first question was, do you have a sense of how well attended the various virtual engagements were?
Yeah, obviously this last year and a half has been a challenge to, again, sort of adapt to the changing climate, but it sort of forced us all to use the technology we all had. And so we got really good at it. We always had a joke that our goal as an outreach team was to keep holding meetings until nobody showed up. You know, that's sort of the sign of a success. And so I thought our virtual meetings actually went really well. You know, we're in the upper Midwest here, and people are somewhat shy of asking questions sometimes, or they communicate in different methods. And so having virtual meetings was great because, you know, those people that like to speak up can speak up. Those that want to chat can chat, or, you know, you have your email address on there. They can send an email while they're, you know, watching the presentation as well. And so it sort of helped. You know, when you're at a public event, there's really only the ability to raise your hand in a room full of your peers and have to ask a question. You hope it's not dumb and that sort of thing. So the virtual meetings actually allowed a lot more private engagements, and they were pretty well attended, and everybody was respectful. And so you didn't have that sort of, you know, click in the corner of the public room kind of snickering the whole time, you know, those sort of things. So we had a lot of success with that. I thought people adapted to it well.
The next question, this is a large project. How would you do similar things when you don't have the resources that this project has? And what was the budget for your campaign?
Yeah, we were definitely fortunate. We probably didn't expect to spend the amount of money we did, just given all the starts and stops. You know, it was, 8 years of project development. And so your budget kind of stretches out over the time. And so, you know, we had up years and down years, but probably consistently, you know, we were $500,000 or a little over for, you know, our outreach efforts every year. And so obviously that's a pretty good budget. You know, it's a large project, but I would say there's a lot of things that we found where, especially now with technology advancements, there's a lot of things that are cheap and effective. I mean, you know, we did drone videos and, you know, high quality footage and stuff, but with iPhones these days, you can go out and take pretty good interviews. You can be on the job site, do all that stuff pretty much as well as you could with a professional team. Elected officials are free, so you can always shoot them for interviews, you know, have them do, you know, if you can get them engaged in the public, you know, that stuff's all free to use. And so it really, you can use the technology in your pocket and the elected officials as your lead spokespeople, and most of that's pretty free. Social media is obviously great for cheap resources. You know, you can spend a lot of time on social media. You can live stream from there. You know, you can live stream on Twitter, your meetings. So you can get a lot of sort of broadcast efforts that used to cost an awful lot of money. And you can do that pretty well free these days. And so I would just say, take advantage of the stuff that you use every day and put it into your program. You know, I think a one-person shop could do an awful lot that you couldn't do when we started this project, just based on the technology that we have today.
Okay. Were there outreach methods that you attempted that were less successful?
Yeah, you know, obviously you learn a lot of lessons too. And the one we joke about in our office was one of the first public meetings. You know, there's a lot of emotions when you have a project where you're ultimately asking some people to sacrifice their land or their home so you can put flood protection there to protect sort of the greater good. We had the bright idea, one of those first meetings, of making matching shirts to wear so that people would know who was, you know, who the public were versus who the private staff were. And that really backfired on us. I think it was much better to be the local entity that we were and, you know, work with the people on a ground level. So it didn't look like we were bringing in all these sort of hotshot consultants types to come in. So that was one thing that was, you know, kind of silly, but it was also a pretty big error on our part when we look back on it. Another one, you know, I think everybody was in this for an altruistic reason. But when you're asking people to sacrifice their lands too, there's a lot of just heated emotions at times. And I think there were points when people got frustrated, and don't just take in that frustration and let it fade away. They fight back at public meetings, or they get defensive by questions, and those things escalate. We had the benefit of having a former U.S. Marshal as one of our county administrators, and he always joked, it takes two to tango. So, if you're the presenter up front, just let the people have their emotions and take it in, and that's their right too. And so that, those things we learned, you got to stay calm, stay peaceful. I'd say maybe one other thing that we resisted a lot is some of our elected officials sort of wanted to fight back against the opposition, kind of go at them. But in all this, those sacrificing for the greater good are sort of the victims as well. And so, they have the right to be angry about things. And so we tried to really push back against some of the direction we got to sort of victim blame, that they're trying to hold up the project and that sort of thing. It's, they're fighting for their rights as well. And so, some of those things, just trying to be empathetic and respectful for this long through, emotions and those sort of things. It's tough and draining, but you got to sort of stay the course and remember why you're in it.
Okay, one more question. We have an unfortunate history of holding public meetings where the public doesn't attend. How do you engage an audience that doesn't want to engage?
Yeah, we had a joke when we'd hold a meeting in the downtown area where somebody said we could fly a plane through our meetings because nobody would show up, but you go down toward the fringes of the community where they're more impacted, one way or another, we fill the room. And so trying to figure out how to get everybody else to care. And, you can lead a horse to water sort of thing. But I think there are some ideas, now that we can record meetings fairly easy and replay them on YouTube. We have a YouTube station. So every meeting we've ever had is recorded. So at least you have the option that you can cross promote, on the city's website or the county's website. You can, replay them on social media. So at least it's there if anybody ever wants it. Trying to get them to show up is tough. But I think if you do that, you have a good summary. I think people hate taking minutes, but if you can write up a concise summary of what the important thing of the meeting and post that with the video, those type of things helps, where people don't have to sit for an hour public presentation where maybe, the engineer's talking and not all that interesting. Is if you can summarize it in a quicker method, there's just have the information transparent and available for people, I think is what I'd recommend.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have there. There are a couple more questions in the chat. If you wanted to go into that, Rocky. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Our next presentation is New Technologies and Skills Will Solve the Challenges of the Future. Our speaker is Joe Clarke with Jacobs. Dr. Joe Clarke plays a major role in Jacobs' UK-based hydroinformatics team, combining technology, expertise, and a deep understanding of the complexity of problem solving and decision making in a water and flood risk management and climate resilience context. Joe develops and applies systems thinking, automation, decision science, and web visualization to solve complex problems and engage stakeholders in the process. And remember, you can always ask questions in the chat as they come to your mind. Go ahead and feel free to put those in there. And with that, here's Joe's presentation.
Hi everyone, I'm Joe Clarke, part of the Jacobs Hydroinformatics team in the UK. Today I'm going to be talking about the shifts in technologies and skills in the industry and how they relate to the challenges we face. When we talk about the process of managing flood risk, what do we think of? And I think for many people, it's all about the design and construction process. And this is clearly a critical part of the story, turning a hypothetical plan into a tangible intervention. And in this space, there's been a dramatic shift in the skills needed by practitioners. Design has shifted into 3 dimensions, and 3D design is a really important part of BIM. The adoption of BIM in the UK has been mandatory for all public works since 2016. And the effect of this has been the emergence of the information management discipline to provide oversight in the way projects are delivered, but also a seismic shift in the way design teams work. This shift has brought with it a great deal of friction as skills try to keep pace with rapidly evolving project needs. But as 3D design becomes the norm, it brings with it opportunities for new technologies. For example, The Jacobs Flood Wall tool automates the process of developing outline 3D designs, pieced together from a library of pre-designed defense components, producing designs in just a few minutes for several kilometers of linear flood defense. This not only makes this early stage design more efficient, it also encourages standardization and best practice and produces rich 3D design outputs. But design and construction are just part of a wider cycle of policy, strategy, and planning. Now, this graphic is based on the ISO 55000 international standard for asset management, but it shows how the whole process is underpinned by evidence. So how do we get to that stage where we're confident that we should be building that wall in the first place? And how is that process changing? And these questions are the focus of my presentation today, and in particular through the lens of how flood modelling supports that evidence base. Over a decade before AutoCAD was first released in 1977, back in 1964, Bill S. Eichert at the Corps of Engineers Tulsa District Office developed a step backwater program, and in 1968 that became HEC 2. That software would end up being translated onto the IBM Micro PC in 1984. And in 1995 would become the first edition of HECRAS. As of 2021, HECRAS has expanded to provide 1 and 2D simulation, sediment transport, and water quality analysis, along with a host of other improvements. Across the Atlantic in the UK, ONDA was developed and first released in 1975. Colleagues from Jacobs recall having a whole floor of the office dedicated to modelling, with cross-section data inputted by hand to produce punch cards that could be fed into a mainframe computer. Over the decades, this would eventually evolve to become Flood Modeler, developing into a single integrated GIS-based user interface to build, run, and post-process results from 1D and 2D simulations, including pushing simulations to the cloud with Flood Cloud. Flood Modeler has become the leading modelling software in the UK, not just for modelling, studies, and the appraisal and design process, but also rapid modelling as part of the UK's flood forecasting systems. And today, a dedicated team at Jacobs continues to develop, test, market, and support Flood Modeler, drawing in skills from computational fluid dynamics, mathematics, and other disciplines to continue to develop the solvers and user interface design and development skills to make that functionality accessible to users. You may be wondering why I began my presentation looking back over the development of flood modelling software. Well, flood modelling has fundamentally changed our understanding of flood risk. But it was also the foundation of the ever-strengthening relationship between water and flood risk domain knowledge and technology and data. And that relationship is at the heart of what I'm talking about today. The traditional approach to flood modelling might be that local flood risk managers identify a potential flood defence intervention and commission a company like Jacobs to build a flood model and run it to represent the baseline and the potential benefits of one or more options. Then use the outputs of that to quantify the benefits of the flood defence scheme. There may be iterations of that through the design process, but the approach is fundamentally constrained by that initial scope. But the industry has changed dramatically, and we're beginning to take a more systems thinking approach to understanding both risk and interventions. We're taking a more strategic approach to considering risk, asset management, and interventions, exploring a larger scale and longer time periods. We're more aware of climate change and its importance in driving flood risk, and the need to take a more adaptive approach to managing risk in the face of uncertainty. We're considering a wider portfolio of responses, from catchment land management down to property flood resilience. And we're considering the role that flood risk management plays in the wider resilience and ecosystem services of the catchment. And what all these drivers have in common is that they dramatically increase the scale and complexity of the underlying evidence needed to support effective decision making, and therefore the volume of flood modelling and the challenge in deriving meaningful information from that modelling. There are many facets to these four drivers, and from a technology and innovation point of view, and from the perspective of skills development, there are a wide range of areas of interest, from innovation in the design process through to innovation in materials and construction processes. But in line with the theme of this talk, I'll be exploring them through a range of examples that focus on the role of modelling and risk evidence in the decision-making process. Now, admittedly, they come from a UK perspective, but I believe these examples and the context in which they sit are globally relevant. The first area I'd like to delve into is that we're becoming more strategic in our management of risk and assets. Going back a decade, the Thames Estuary 2100 plan built a strategic plan for investment to manage tidal flood risk in London. Until recently, this has felt like an outlier. But more and more, we're starting to see city, regional, and catchment scale strategic consideration of flood risk and a greater emphasis on whole life asset management. In the Humber Estuary, the Humber 2100 Plus project is a collaboration between the National Environment Agency, local government, and other stakeholders to strategically plan for managing flood risk in the estuary. And we're looking at strategic intervention options at that large estuary scale. Now, this requires over 700 large-scale flood simulations representing different high-level options. To achieve this, we used Floodplatform, our high-performance computing cluster for flood modelling, to manage data and automate the process of modelling and post-processing. Floodplatform's been applied on over 400 projects with hundreds of thousands of simulations. But a project of this complexity introduced whole new demands for how we interpret information. So we also developed a visualization tool to enable stakeholders to interact with and interrogate the outputs from the modelling. As well as skills in modelling, automation, and data management, we therefore introduced a requirement for skills in web technologies, and in particular in this case, web mapping. Climate change is a major global challenge, and flood risk is just one of its many effects. The World Resources Institute estimates that the number of people exposed to river flooding globally will double from 65 million to 132 million people just over the next 10 years and will triple by 2050. Climate's also becoming a bigger driver within the flood risk industry, both in terms of the causes of climate change and our understanding of its effects. For example, President Biden has pledged to cut US greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030 compared with 2005. And in England, the Environment Agency has a target of reaching net zero carbon by 2030. These decisions have a clear impact on the way in which we will design and construct flood defences through low-carbon technology. But uncertainty in the extent to which climate change will affect flood risk presents a key challenge: how we can make investment decisions now in the face of that future uncertainty. The Oxcam Arc is a region in England to the north and west of London. It's home to 3.7 million people and supports 2 million jobs. And 1 million new homes are expected to be built over a period of just 30 years, alongside major infrastructure investment. But there's great uncertainty in the effect of climate change and of the shape and scale of that development, creating a challenge in understanding how best to invest in flood resilience. To tackle this problem, we've run 25,000 simulations across 750 models spanning the region to form the evidence base for an economic analysis to optimize the level of investment in flood risk management, based on the whole life value it delivers. But in the face of uncertainty, not just in climate change, but also in the shape and pace of development, we've had to adopt an approach to optimization which reflects that uncertainty and ensures, through adaptive approaches, that robust decisions are made now, which offer value for money and resilience under a range of possible futures. Our analysis is based around the principle of a decision tree. Now, or at some point in the future, we can choose to invest in a combination of interventions, or to defer investment. and can therefore consider the timing and nature of our interventions and the way they can be used together. Here, this is simplified to no intervention, a small intervention, or a large intervention. A precautionary approach might assume that we invest in a larger intervention now. But if we do that, we have to be willing to accept that there's a degree of uncertainty in the return on investment and the benefits that that large intervention would provide. And it may be that risk changes in ways that we don't expect. Conversely, an adaptive approach might assume we invest less now, and that future investment is dependent on future changes in risk. A real options analysis is a type of approach that enables us to compare those two different approaches to investment by looking at that investment under different futures and weighting costs and benefits under each future by the likelihood of those occurring, whilst allowing for flexibility in future decisions within that analysis. This example considers decisions at just 2 points in time for two types of intervention. For us to optimize the level and timing of investment for OxCam, we're considering decisions at 10-year intervals over 100 years. Now, this graphic shows how the decision tree grows over just the first 5 decision points every 10 years for 50 years. But we're also considering a wider range of interventions over different spatial scales. So we could estimate that there are a total of 27 million possible intervention combinations just in the first year. A decision tree built from that many combinations over 10 decision points would have a total of 2 times 10 to the power of 74 branches. So we are firmly in the realms of data science, looking to find solutions to that complicated computational problem. For example, we're exploring using a variant of the Dijkstra algorithm, which is an algorithm developed to find the shortest path between nodes in a graph, commonly used by route finding tools, where in our case, each node is a particular combination of interventions at a particular point in time. We're also exploring the use of genetic algorithms, which are a type of algorithm based on the process of natural selection, where the fittest individuals are selected for reproduction to produce the next generation of offspring. And in our case, fittest will be measured by the net present value of a sequence of interventions, taking forward those combinations of intervention and timings of intervention that appear to provide the most value for money. A major driver of complexity in this particular challenge is the link between climate adaptation and the adoption of a wider portfolio of responses. Historically, investment in flood risk management was focused on hard engineering interventions, but more recently there's been a clear shift towards considering those alongside a wider portfolio of interventions. And this is driven in part by shifts in policy. In England, the Flood and Coastal Erosion Management Strategy, published in 2020, has shifted focus from managing the likelihood of flooding to managing resilience more holistically. In the US, things like the American Jobs Plan, released at the end of March this year, puts a heavy focus not just on infrastructure, but specifically on investing in making infrastructure more resilient, including protecting and restoring nature-based infrastructure. So I think we'll see a similar shift both sides of the Atlantic. My previous example of the OxCam project is actually also a good example for exploring a range of interventions for managing flood risk. But the project is still ongoing, so I don't have any results to share. So instead, I'll turn to a series of projects called the Long-Term Investment Scenarios, or LTIS. Now, these are being carried out nationally in England with the purpose of optimising national-scale investment in flood risk management. In the past, they've been focused on hard engineering interventions. By exploring different local management policies, LTIS could identify the change in value as you increase investment, to produce a simple-to-understand graph like this. Now, underneath, the LTIS relies heavily on database-driven data analysis and software development to produce a reusable optimization tool. But the most recent work for LTIS has introduced a whole range of catchment, local, and property-level interventions So rather than these 6 points on a graph, we end up with 800 national scale investment scenarios, 8,000 if we include upper and lower estimates. And the challenge of presenting, communicating, and understanding those outputs, and in particular the uncertainty in them, becomes much greater. And while this graph is a fun way to show off how complex the results are, it doesn't really help us to understand the problem or to make better decisions. So, we also developed a simple interactive web application to visualize the key messages from the whole system Deltares analysis. You drag sliders up or down to invest more or less in each type of intervention. As you do that, it draws the results of those 800 scenarios to present you with a summary of the level of investment, remaining risk, and a score for the value for money you're achieving. It uses national data but presents the changes in an indicative catchment through simple sketches. Now, for me, this is a really interesting piece of work because it required extensive use of automation, large-scale data management and analysis, data science techniques in the optimization, but also visualization. And that had to be coupled with an expert knowledge of not just flood risk, but also other disciplines like economics. The final area that I'm going to look at is that we're starting to consider the role that flood risk management plays in the wider resilience and ecosystem services of a catchment, such as water security, natural flood management, and natural capital. Natural flood management is all about working with natural processes rather than against them. And it's been estimated that only 10% of the economic value of natural flood management is in flood risk reduction, and the remainder is through the ecosystem services it delivers. And some of the examples I've already shared have started to dip their toes into this wider systems thinking approach to managing the catchment. But the concept of managing a catchment in a more integrated way feels like the next big shift in the industry, where we think not just about flood risk modelling, but flood risk, water supply, infrastructure, and wider socioeconomic models that build up a more holistic picture of a catchment and provide evidence to manage resilience in a climate change uncertain world, and through the uncertainty in other changes. So how do we achieve all this? Well, we still need expert modelers to build models. We still need software developers to build and improve flood modeling and all the other tools that we use. For example, projects like OxCam wouldn't be feasible without recent developments in GPU solvers in flood modeling. We need designers who can implement the detailed design of interventions, and we need flood risk management experts and economists who can take a strategic view and support the decision-making and funding process. And alongside that, we need data analysts and data scientists who can work with large volumes of geospatial data and automate processes to make this kind of analysis viable. But crucially, I think we need people who can speak the language of the industry and the language of data to bridge that gap between domain expertise and technology. People who can work with, visualize, and communicate flood risk information that comes out of complex analysis in a way that suits the needs of their stakeholders. In Jacobs in the UK, we've recognised this as a discipline in its own right, and we call ourselves hydroinformatics, sitting at that cross-section between technology and sector knowledge, and being able to speak those two languages. But we can't work in a silo. We fit into a community of experts and need that community to embrace technology solutions that enable them to apply their expertise to solve the bigger challenges, rather than being fearful that technology makes their skills redundant. But also to recognise opportunities to apply technologies in new ways, and to start applying technology in every area of expertise. Because it's only by working together and raising the bar for technology knowledge, but without sacrificing domain expertise, that we'll be able to solve the challenges of the future. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Joe, for that presentation. We did have a few questions come in through the chat. The first is, how do you ensure social equity is integrated into decision-making going forward? The fittest metric will inevitably leave some communities behind because net present value is affected by historical inequities.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think certainly in the UK, it's interesting because funding actively orients investment to counter that bias. The way our government flood risk management funding works, say more deprived communities earn a greater degree of government funding for flood risk interventions. But when we come to this kind of high level economic analysis, we tend to be slightly less oriented towards factoring that kind of thing in. So I think that's a real issue at the moment. I think as we start to grapple a little bit more with how we value natural capital and social value at a scale that can fit into this kind of analysis, it feels as though we'll be able to consider that at this bigger scale. So it's at the forefront of the analysis rather than an afterthought. But I think, yeah, at the moment, I feel like that's probably one of the biggest limitations of the way that these kinds of analyses work.
Okay. Is there a web address to check out the web tool to show what would happen given different types of investment?
There is. Can I, if I type in the box, can I share that? I can share that link, can't I? I'll do that after after we turn the camera off.
Okay. And let's see, along the same lines, did your modeling include water quality as well?
No, but I think that's in particular for Oxcam, where there's a real need to take that integrated catchment management approach. I think that's the next step, is to factor in water supply, water quality, and in particular where we're looking at flood risk management interventions where they're sort of working with natural processes, sort of NFM type things, where actually sort of 90% of the benefit of them is in natural capital, water quality type benefits, and only 10% is flood risk management. But we have this, certainly in the UK, a tendency to try and shoehorn it in as a flood risk intervention, where actually, if we take a more integrated approach, we'll be able to better value the benefit that it brings.
Okay, and then this type of work likely won't be within the capability of local jurisdictions and could be too heavy a lift financially to hire it out. What's the smallest scale local entities to use your services, and how do you see being able to deliver those services to smaller projects in the future?
Yeah, so I think the Oxcam project has been, we're really lucky to be able to apply that at that scale, but actually the scale itself brings a lot of the challenges. So I think there's always an appropriate way of looking at it at a more local scale. So I would say that the complexity scales down at a faster pace than the spatial scale. So I'd almost argue that once we're getting to a more local scale, it's more manageable, and a lot of the technological complexity comes from that, trying to do this kind of analysis at a large scale. I guess there's still that challenge of looking at it in a more integrated way, and how your kind of local area sits within the wider system. In my experience, we've always found an appropriate solution for the task at hand, the scale of the problem. So sort of when we've looked at more local scales, we've done so at without a lot of this technology. But in some ways, the more local you get, the more details expected. So with sort of the comparison between ELTIS, which is a national scale assessment, we almost actively promote generalizations and not making drawing local conclusions from it. Even scaling down to a regional scale, the expectations of the level of detail and the extent to which you can make draw local outcomes for it, and the requirements that puts on the evidence and the modeling and the economics behind it goes up quite a lot. So I think at a local scale, while technologically it might be simpler, the expectations would also be quite a lot higher. I don't think that's really a straight answer to the question, but
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah. Our next presentation is Playing for Keeps, Serious Games for Floodplain. He primarily develops and applies decision-making under deep uncertainty methodologies, such as adaptation pathways to incorporate future uncertainties into long-term strategic planning processes. He has worked in a variety of international settings in both developed and emerging economies, and particularly enjoys contextualizing DMDU approaches to the realities present in each setting. An experienced facilitator and trainer, Andrew also enjoys engaging stakeholders in planning processes through the development and application collaborative modeling, and including serious gaming. And here's Andrew's presentation.
Good morning. My name is Andrew Warren and I'm an expert in climate adaptation and integrated water resources management at Deltares. For those of you unaware, Deltares is a not-for-profit independent research institute based in the Netherlands with a focus on water resources related management of the surface and subsurface, where management encompasses a broad range of domains, including flood risk management, groundwater management, coastal zone management, reservoir and river operations, the resiliency of service networks such as water, energy and road networks, and offshore operations. Part of our work focuses on the meaningful engagement of stakeholders within planning and design processes, and one of the tools we use to achieve this is serious gaming. This presentation will describe Deltares' approach to serious gaming, its theoretical underpinnings, and the advantages we feel that it brings in terms of project delivery and its ability to help solve complex, practical problems. The presentation will also present key lessons we have learned from the development of our games over the past 12 years, which could be applied by others seeking to develop their own games in the future. But why serious games? Serious games are receiving increasing attention as effective tools for stakeholder engagement and learning. They provide a fun and engaging environment in which to share and translate scientific knowledge and information. They challenge players by simulating realistic problems. Players can test a range of potential solutions and observe the practical implications with no delay, which gives them the opportunity to learn in a safe environment and avoid disastrous situations. The realism of serious games heightens the experience and helps to communicate scientific information. Multiplayer games also encourage discussions between participants, and the exchange of information promotes teamwork and allows players to better understand the processes in which they are involved. So we very much see serious games as tools to support innovation. And here I'll refer to the cartoon on your screen. Here the serious game is the ability to be able to test innovative solutions, such as a circular wheel, to a common problem, such as square wheels on a wheelbarrow. But the key element in all of this is that the serious game helps to overcome the opposition of the two elves on the right to try something new. Having a fun and engaging tool with which to test a potential innovation can make the difference between successful uptake or not of that innovation. At Deltares, we see there being 4 roles of serious games. The first is in terms of knowledge dissemination. As a knowledge institute, serious games offer Deltares a valuable and engaging tool with which we can effectively share the knowledge we develop, particularly in terms of the way that systems integrate with each other and function. The second role we see for serious games is very much in terms of their ability to raise awareness, specifically as it relates to more difficult to grasp concepts or perhaps sets of future conditions that may be unimaginable for the players involved. And here we can use scenario-based games to help test these sets of conditions and give players the experience of these so that they can find out what it might feel like to make decisions under these types of, under these conditions. The third role of a serious game is, the third role we see serious games playing is very much as a process accelerator. And here we think very much in terms of the multiplayer games, where the interactions and the shared experiences that go on during a game session can be used as a catalyst, or can serve as a catalyst rather, to stimulate action in the real world, be that cooperation between actors who had not yet been effectively cooperating, between trialing different solutions that others may not have yet thought of. And here is the link to the last role of a serious game, being innovation, where you can try things safely, things that otherwise you wouldn't want to try in the real world because people were a little bit too reticent about what the potential impacts may be. With a serious game, you can test those impacts and see whether or not the potential solution will prove effective or not. So in summary, serious games are useful tools to build stakeholder capacity in better managing challenging decision-making environments. And we see them as allowing us to combine three core elements: reality, meaning, and play. Now, combining reality, meaning, and play forms the cornerstone of Deltares' approach to game design. Sometimes referred to triadic game design. It's a theory that was developed by an academic, Caspar Harteveld, who was formerly of the Delft University of Technology. Now, he developed this theory to ensure that serious games were able to deliver on desired outcomes, whilst remaining serious, but also fun. But what exactly do we mean by each of these three aspects? And the next slides, I'm going to go into each of them in a little more detail. Firstly, we have reality. Now, if we're talking about a serious game, what makes it serious is the fact that it is representing a real world challenge. So there is a problem that needs to be confronted, a real world problem that we need to confront. And we need to incorporate into the game the key factors involved in that challenge and the relationships between them. And often if we're talking about decision making over time, we want to know how the problem is going to evolve over time and how the potential solutions will interact with that, and whether or not how effective they will, how long they will prove effective for. And these are the types of factors that we want to incorporate in terms of the reality sphere. And reality is a domain that's very much focused on experts. And at Deltares, this is essentially our bread and butter, and this is the element of game design with which we feel most comfortable. But it's also the element of game design that we have a lot of trouble with, because often we want to inject too much reality into our games. So of course, there's always the balance between trying to inject enough reality versus to achieve the outcomes, but not too much so as to overwhelm the players. The second core element is, of course, meaning. And this is essentially what is the purpose of the game. What do you want it to achieve? What are the outcomes you want it to deliver in terms of knowledge development, skills development, or perhaps attitude change? The other element of meaning is, of course, how you will achieve these outcomes. So what learning strategies will you employ? Is it going to be simply one of repetition and practice? Or will there be opportunities for discussion and reflection and feedback for the players? And then, of course, there's also who is going to be playing it, who is the target audience, when's it going to be played, how often, so on and so forth. And so this is very much the realm of educational professionals and storytellers and so on and so forth. The third element of game design is that of play. And the key thing about a serious game is that it still needs to be a game. It needs to be interactive and engaging. It needs to be fun. nobody wants to play a boring game. And if nobody wants to play the game, no one is going to learn from the game. Therefore, you will not achieve your outcomes. So in terms of play, the types of things we're talking about is making sure that there is a very clear objective in the game for the players. So this is not what I was talking about before in terms of meaning and the purpose and outcomes, but rather what is the objective of the game from a player perspective? Do I need to ensure that a city doesn't flood? Do I need to ensure that an agricultural district has enough water to meet its demands into the future? So on and so forth. What objectives are set for the players to achieve? And then the other elements come in to help support that objective in terms of like the game mechanics. What setting is it being played in? Is it a fictitious setting? Is it a real setting? What are the rules being that are incorporated? What can players do and what limitations do they face? And then also, more prosaically, what technologies and game materials are being employed? Is it a software-based game? Is it a virtual game? Is it a tabletop game with boards and cards and tokens and so on and so forth? And this is very much the realm of game designers and artists and so on and so forth. So in triadic game design and at Deltares, we're always trying to balance these three elements: play, meaning, and reality. And during game design, they need to be considered concurrently because there are often inherent trade-offs that need to be made between the three worlds. It's very easy to end up with a game that, well, at Deltares has too much reality. And then you end up with essentially a model. Yes, you can use your model to test the impacts of various interventions and various scenarios, but it's not very fun. And perhaps it doesn't necessarily teach your stakeholders anything because it's, because it lacks that fun element and because they're not particularly interested in it. Likewise, if it has too much meaning, perhaps you end up with a PowerPoint presentation. Again, it's not fun. It doesn't have enough reality, but you're really focused on translating the learning objective and the message across about what you want your audience to learn. And then finally, you could have too much play where you end up with an entertainment game such as Grand Theft Auto or Fortnite or some other such game with which you might be familiar. And of course, as with any design process, it's an iterative process. So constantly, when we're undertaking our game design, we're asking ourselves, what should we include? But more importantly, what can we exclude? What do we need our players to know? Or what can they get away with not knowing? What do we want them to share? What information do we want them to share amongst each other? Do we want a game that's more based on fiction and perhaps introduces some really fictive and fun elements, or do we want something that is a little bit more real and based on real world processes and so on and so forth? So on the basis of triadic game design, Deltares has developed various serious games for several aspects of life in Delta regions. And we very much view serious gaming as an essential tool for strategic planning, for training for crisis situations, but then also simply for education. Our games typically combine knowledge about environment and infrastructure. They incorporate game rules that reflect the span of control of the stakeholders. And then they also typically include a realistic visualization of the game area, be it fictitious or not. Our serious games are often played by policymakers, students, water managers, infrastructure inspectors, but then also sometimes the general public. I'm now going to tell you about two of our games, and these are the two that are most related to flood risk management. The first game I'm going to talk about is Sustainable Delta, which was a game that was developed to facilitate stakeholder learning about the importance of adaptation planning and preparing for an uncertain future. It simulates interactions between between water systems and society by augmenting scientific and technical information with climate change scenarios and decision-making processes. In a nutshell, Sustainable Delta is a game where two competing teams must develop a 100-year sustainable water management plan for a river delta, floodplain or coastal area in the face of future uncertainties such as climate change or socioeconomic developments. It's typically played across multiple rounds of 20 to 25 years, and each of the teams is tasked with negotiating with the other about how to develop this area, what measures to put in place in terms of flood protection, in terms of development, perhaps developing areas for future residential areas or future agricultural areas or for nature or so on and so forth. But essentially, how can they manage the flood risk in the area while still maintaining other core outcomes? We've got 3 settings to play in which to play the game: 2 river and 1 coastal. The 2 river ones are modelled on variously on either on environments in the Netherlands or New Zealand, with issues being covered including flood risk management, navigation, agriculture, but then also nature. And the key performance indicators in those games are according to those issues. And in the coastal game, it's also flood risk management, but then much more on transport outcomes relating to flooding of roads and port facilities, and also the nature aspects. In terms of the game process, as I say, it's an iterative process played across multiple rounds where the existing system is analysed and its impacts assessed. The broader contextual information about the broader context is introduced by way of newspapers. And then each of the teams assess all this information and look at the potential policy actions they have available to them before they then select their preferred actions, negotiate with the other team, implement those policies in a simulation model, and then ascertain the impacts, and the process starts again. Within the game, we've got a number of features. So as I've alluded to, there's a set of policy action cards from which each of the teams can choose their preferred actions. And typically in a game, we would have around about 30 to 40 policy action cards. The broader socioeconomic context, that is supplied by way of the newspapers, as I say, and this is really a way to steer the game process and the game narrative towards the desired learning objectives. And this is a way to incorporate features such as economic crises or broader societal attitudes and so on and so forth that otherwise wouldn't be captured by the simulation model itself. And then in the game we also have a 3D visualization of the setting, which can help to visualize the spatial impact of measures, and the simulation model that I've mentioned previously. It's a fast model that is able to provide almost instantaneous feedback on the impacts of their actions after each round. And this is a way of introducing real-world data into the game. So we have real-world climate scenarios based on IPCC data. We have real-world digital elevation models that are present within the game settings. They're slightly modified to enhance gameplay. We've got real-world depth damage relationships to help calculate flood risk impacts or flood impacts, and then rules of thumb, expert judgment rules of thumb for things like environmental or ecological impacts, nature impacts. One of the key things about Sustainable Delta that is incorporated is the moments within the game for discussion between the teams and amongst the teams, and reflection about how they're performing and the types of measures they might like to introduce, and then after the game, another moment to really discuss how they have played the game, what perhaps they would have done differently, and these sorts of things. And this is where we can really introduce the concepts like adaptive planning and other decision making under deep uncertainty methodologies, and so on and so forth to serve that learning outcome. So, in summary, Sustainable Delta, it's a game that's really geared towards raising awareness about the importance of adaptive planning and planning under uncertainty. And it's a game that's been applied all over the world. So it's been applied in the Netherlands, it's been applied in Denmark, in Bangladesh, Indonesia, and various other contexts, all with the specific goal of trying to encourage planners to think about long-term uncertainties when they're making their infrastructure choices. And it's been very successful in doing so. We have seen that adaptive planning has become increasingly more adopted by water management authorities around the world, and know that Sustainable Delta has played a role in delivering on that. The second game I want to talk about briefly is a game called Levee Patroller. Now this differs to Sustainable Delta in that it's not a multiplayer game, but is rather an individual player game. And it's not really geared at planners as such, but really it's an operational game for professional and volunteer levee inspectors, where it's a training tool for them to learn about what to focus on during their dike inspections. What telltale signs of potential dike failure should they be looking out for, and what remedial actions can they take to help avoid potential dike failures? I'm going to just start up a quick demo of Levee Patroller, and you can see the level of realism that we're able to inject into these games. You know, you've got a dike, it's raining, high water level over on the right there. We see a potential failure emerging along the road, and as the video continues, you see that failure actually starting to occur as the earth slips on the dike, and then you see how that failure actually propagates further throughout the dike, and eventually leads to complete failure and flooding of the environment behind. So this is obviously a calamitous example, but for the trainee levee patrollers who are using this game, they can essentially walk around the area and look out for any of these telltale signs and take remedial action, hopefully before these conditions emerge. If they emerge, oh well, it was just a game. This was a safe environment in which for them to learn that they should have done something earlier. And through repetition, they can build their skills in that area. And Levee Patroller is a game that is still presently being used in the Netherlands by the water boards, and you know, it continues to be, as I say, continues to be used 10 years after it was first developed. So these are just two of our games, but we are also, Deltares is also engaged in developing games across other domains related to water resources management. For example, we have a game related to the sustainable development of ports. And last year we worked together with the Army Corps of Engineers in the United States to develop a game concept for watershed management. And we are very much hoping to be able to collaboratively develop that further with them in the coming year or so. But in summary, serious games, they're useful and effective tools for stakeholder engagement and learning, particularly in complex decision-making environments, when our ability to model a complete integrated system may be constrained. We can introduce more social elements or elements of the social system that otherwise we would not be able to capture through gameplay. And in undertaking game design, it's always about balancing these three core elements of reality, meaning, and play. We need to make sure the game is fun. We need to make sure it achieves its outcomes. And in doing so, it needs to be to have an adequate reflection of reality. But the core of this entire task we have found over 12 years of developing games is that it's important to really focus on a limited set of learning objectives and really focus in on those and delivering on those well, and simplifying everything else wherever possible. I'm going to leave it there for now, but if there's any questions, of course, there's the Q&A session following. But if you would like to drop me a line following this presentation, then please feel free at the email address on the screen, or feel free to check out the website at the link also listed on your screen. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thanks for the presentation, Andrew. We did have a few questions come in through the chat. The first one, are your games primarily video games, or do you do tabletop as well?
We do a mixture, Laurie. So the multiplayer games that we develop up until now are essentially a blend of video and tabletop. And we very much value having the tabletop materials there. And as I mentioned in the presentation, the face-to-face interactions that can occur in those settings. But then, as you saw with Levy Patroller, that's a pure video game for an individual player. So we pretty much do the whole gamut. We haven't so much done standalone tabletop games, i.e. those without the digital element, but that's primarily due to the fact that we want to inject a little bit more reality and some of that data into the game process.
And what is the typical game length for your design?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Sustainable Delta, that's a game that takes around about 2 hours to play. Likewise, our Sustainable Ports game is around about something similar to that. But Levy Patroller, I mean, that's a game that can be played in half an hour. But I think when it comes down to designing a game and developing a game, that's one of the parameters that's open to discussion. How long will you have people in the room in which you want to keep them engaged and playing these games? Say, for example, the USACE game that the Army Corps of Engineers games that we helped develop the concept for last year, that essentially was 3 concepts in one, and ranged from a game that could be played very, very quickly within half an hour to something that could be played much more extensively over a longer period of time, up to that kind of maximum 2-hour limit.
Okay, and a lot of questions about where can we get the game? Is there online version? Do they purchase them? How does that work?
Yeah, in terms of online, I'm afraid not. We're currently in the process of developing a new gaming framework, which will be more geared towards supporting virtual play. So, and what I mean by that is, or remote play. Given the current context with COVID and lockdown and so on, all our face-to-face games we essentially have not been able to play for the last year or so. So we're moving towards that sort of model. But yeah, in terms of access to the games, your best bet is to contact me directly. We don't typically charge licensing fees for our games, but there is a lot in them, and we typically require that the people who do want to play the game follow a training course and so on and so forth. So if anyone is interested in some of our games, then I certainly would invite them to drop me a line and send me an email.
Okay, and one last question. Do you create games for individual regions or communities by request?
Yes. We certainly do, and I mean, as I say, that's one of the reasons we've been working with the Army Corps. That's obviously a much larger scale in terms of trying to build something that could be generalizable across the states. But yeah, if people have specific gaming needs, they can come to us and ask us to develop something, and we can do that within a variety of budgets.
Okay, great. Well, I don't see any other questions, so thank you for the presentation, and thank you everyone for joining this session today.
Thanks for having me.